At Westminster, now BBC Two in Politics Live.
It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
A defence dividend that will be felt in the pockets of working people and the prosperity of the country, securing growth for generations to come.
Billions more of taxpayers' money is to be spent on defence, but can security and prosperity go hand in hand?
A battle-ready, armour-clad nation with the strongest alliances and the most advanced capabilities.
The Defence Review will say that the UK should move to war-fighting readiness, but are Brits ready to fight?
Those strategies of the past have run out, and I think we're stuck in a doom loop with low growth and high costs of borrowing.
As we approach next week's spending review, are politicians being honest about the choices we face? And more than 1,000 migrants arrived by small boats on Saturday. Is the government's strategy to deter them working? Joining me today on my first day in the chair, Labour MP Joe White, Conservative MP and Shadow Scotland Secretary Andrew Bowie, The Telegraph's Annabel Denham and the iPaper columnist Andrew Fisher. This is Politics Live. Well, we heard there from the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, saying that there's going to be what he calls a defence dividend and that extra military spending will boost the economy. So the question is he right, Joe?
He's absolutely right. We're in a situation where the security of our country has become greater and greater. We have the Russians, in my view, breathing down our neck. We have incursions into the North Sea and into the English Channel with submarines very, very regularly. And we need to be on top of that. And it's our patriotic duty to protect our country, and taking decisions like this now is very much the right thing to do.
Well, we know there's going to be a cost to it, but will it make the country richer or poorer? Taxpayers are going to have to fork out more.
Well, I think tough decisions are going to have to be made. You'll find no disagreement from the Conservatives that increasing defence spending is a good thing. It's the first duty of government to ensure the security and the defence of the realm. And so broadly, what we heard today is very positive from that perspective. There is some concern that the 3% commitment is not actually nailed on and it remains just an ambition. So we don't actually know how much money is going to be set aside or dedicated to the purpose of ensuring or bolstering the UK's defence. But yes, greater defence spending can mean greater prosperity as it creates jobs across the country in the defence manufacturing sites that we have, be that in Scotland, in Barrow and Furness, or indeed in other parts of the country as well.
And Annabelle, is it all upside? Is it an upside for everybody?
Well,
Not just the defence industry?
Well, I think in theory, defence spending is always a good investment if having a stronger armed forces acts as a credible deterrent that might stop a war or indeed might, in a worst case scenario, help us win a war and stem any future losses, then obviously it's worth doing. And as Andrew says, it's important that we do it on a number of levels. I think there is potential to create high-value industries which are developing the military technologies of the future. So there's a lot of potential for new sectors to emerge in that respect. However, I do worry that we are falling into the trap of assuming that the only ingredient for growth is government spending. So let's increase government spending on the public sector. Let's increase public sector wages, rather than how can we actually boost the productive side of the economy? How can we boost the private sector through, in my view at least, tax cuts, deregulation, creating the right environment and the right incentives for people to start, grow businesses, to work and to work harder.
Andrew, what do you make of extra defence spending? Will it make people feel richer?
Well, let's see. I mean, there are a number of factors I think the government needs to weigh up in the spending review, not just defence. There are clearly huge pressures on the NHS, on incomes. We have record levels of people living in poverty, record numbers of families in temporary accommodation as well. So there are lots of competing demands. And look, just from a policy point of view, attaching a kind of percentage of GDP to something isn't always the best way of funding something. You know,
which is the government's aim. It's saying 3% at some point.
And it's saying 2.5%, I think, by the end of this Parliament, 3% at some point in the future, not quite specified yet. You know, if the economy shrinks, if we have a severe recession, are we really going to drop the amount of defence spending? If it if we have a rapid period of growth, and a kind of unbelievable period of growth, which Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer would be delighted to have, are we going to therefore put far more than we expected into defence? It's not always good to tie it to that. If the country has a recession, you don't necessarily need to reduce defence spending in response. So I'm kind of cautious about it, but clearly the threats we face have changed. The technology that wars are fought with, as we've seen in Ukraine and Russia, have clearly changed and advanced massively, and we do need to invest in those new technologies. And if we can invest in that and bring jobs to the UK, not outsource it to French companies and American defence armaments, and create jobs in this country, creating growth and jobs and tax revenues as well, which help fund it, then that's a very good thing. I'm not against that. But I think we also need to consider where all the money is going and that it's well spent, because the best will in the world, the Ministry of Defence hasn't always had the best record in terms of procurement, and that goes back over multiple governments. You look at the Ajax tanks, look at various other procurement issues. We've wasted tens of billions of pounds as well. So as long as it's well spent, as long as it meets the demands of today, I don't think there's a problem with it in theory.
OK, well, the Prime Minister was in Glasgow this morning making that speech. Let's have a little listen to what else he had to say.
We are moving to warfighting readiness as the central purpose of our armed forces. When we are being directly threatened by states with advanced military forces, the most effective way to deter them is to be ready. And frankly, to show them that we're ready, to deliver peace through strength. We'll build a fighting force that is more integrated, more ready, more lethal than ever, backed by a stronger strategic reserve, fully trained and ready to mobilise at any time.
Well, also in Glasgow, I'm delighted to say, is our political editor, Chris Mason, who joins me now. And Chris, a lot in this speech. We've heard a lot about it over the past few days. What is Keir Starmer trying to achieve here?
Yeah, hello to you, Vicky. It was an extraordinary spot, actually, we were in with the Prime Minister. This vast new hall with the kind of skeletons of these two new ships that are under construction. What was the Prime Minister trying to do? This was the framework, or so he hopes, the kind of blueprint for defence for the next decade-ish, perhaps a little more than that. Trying to, and this has been an ongoing conversation, I think, for a while, kind of make an argument to the wider electorate that defence is going to have to matter more, both in terms of the money that's spent on it and just society's overall outlook, if you like, really, on our security and the armed forces than has been the case for perhaps the last generation. But then within that, the trade-offs and the decisions that there are around budgets, because we've got the spending review coming up a week on Wednesday, setting out government departments' budgets for the next handful of years. And it's in that context, as well as all those rows that we had in the last couple of weeks about the winter fuel payment and benefits cuts, etc., that the whole debate about defence also sits, because, to govern is to choose, and so where is money spent, and therefore where is money not spent?
And just briefly on that, Chris, on the money, the government has talked about getting to 3% of GDP, and various figures in government are sounding more or less concerned about that. Some are saying it could go much quicker. Where are we on how firm that commitment is?
Yeah, I think this is absolutely key here, particularly when you look at the words of the authors of the Defence Review in a piece that they've written in the Telegraph this morning. So they are talking around the extent to which what they are suggesting can be delivered. And they say the government's important decision, as they put it, to raise defence spending to 2.5% of national output by 2027 is vital. They then say, vitally, to raise it to 3% in the next Parliament makes an enormous difference. The decision established the affordability of our recommendations across a 10-year programme. And that's why I asked the Prime Minister earlier, and others asked variations on the same thing. Hang on a minute, what about that 3%? Because that is currently described as an ambition. Whether it will be delivered if it fits in with the fiscal, the economic circumstances at the time. What happens if they are to change. So there's a caveat there, there's wriggle room there, and then you, as I say, you put that in the context of all of the other rows that always circulate around a government, around priorities, and yes, you do wonder, hang on a minute, is that 3% definitely deliverable? And then the context, the wider context, is one where there are other countries around Europe who are promising more than 3% and have nailed that down to a particular date. It's also true to say there are some of the European countries that are relative laggards in terms of defence spending. And all of this ahead of a NATO summit, the NATO Defence Alliance annual summit in The Hague in just a couple of weeks' time, where there'll be a huge amount of focus on these proportions of national income and, frankly, who is pulling their weight and who isn't.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for talking to us today on all of that. Now, a lot of what the Prime Minister was talking about was about equipment, about weaponry, but it's about people as well. Have a look at this headline, which says that it's from YouGov, the pollsters. More than a third of the under 40s would refuse conscription in the event of a world war. And there are some military leaders talking about, quite imminent things happening that might involve, people having to fight. Are you surprised by that?
I think if that similar surveys done before the First or Second World War, I think people would have, the same data would have come out. When you're actually faced with the prospect of war, as in what happened in Ukraine, attitudes very, very quickly change. I very much support the creation of a reserve army. I think it is the patriotic thing to do. I've already met quite a number of reservists, both in my constituency and out and about. And it gives new training, it gives a new perspective, and you're actually doing something for your country. So this is the way I want to see us working at the start. And so I hope we never get onto war footing, attitudes would very, very quickly change.
I mean, the YouGov survey also found that 38% of under 40s said they would refuse to serve in the armed forces in the event of a war.
Well, we're not in that situation.
Do you think it might change if we got...
Yes, obviously, the defence of our country is something that everybody, if you're asked that question, I think you'd very quickly change your mind.
Andrew?
I'm always taken by surveys that show results like that, and I think back to the famous Oxford Union vote, and I think it was 1938 when the Oxford Union voted that this House would not fight for king or country. And I think when war was declared almost to a man, every single one of those members of the Oxford Union actually joined up and ended up serving in the Second World War. So, you take these things with a pinch of salt until that moment comes. I dare say that most Ukrainians would never have considered serving in the armed forces until the moment Russia stepped across the Ukrainian border. So I'm of the view that should the time come that the next generation of Brits would do their duty in the same way that their grandparents and great-grandparents did before them.
I don't know how old you are, but would you serve?
Well, 30. I was a full-time serving officer in the Royal Navy for 4 years before I came into this gig. So yes, I very much would.
What do you think the public attitude is to this, particularly young people?
I fear that we can't be complacent here, and actually it may be worse than that YouGov study suggests, because last year there was research out which showed that just 11% of Gen Z would be willing to fight for their country. We are ultimately psychologically unprepared for war. I fear that a lot of young people wouldn't really know what they're fighting for at the moment. Patriotism has become a dirty word in this country. We seem to be losing our sense of identity, of our culture, of our values, and all the while we do have a personnel crisis in the armed forces across all three services that needs to be addressed. It's not just the recruitment, but it's also the retention. It's not just the recruitment and retention, but it's also the morale. There's further the question of how we treat our veterans. I think sailors and soldiers haven't been supported in the way that they ought to have been once they've left the service. So there are so many questions and issues which need to be addressed in that regard. But if young people are looking at our increasingly dangerous world and wondering whether they would be willing to serve and they decide against it, I wouldn't be altogether surprised, nor would I necessarily blame them.
Andrew?
Well, I think if you look at the wars that young people, people under 40, which doesn't include me, have witnessed in their lifetimes, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, there haven't been great successes, have they? British military interventions in those three states. And I can understand why people would look at that and say, well, no, I don't want to be a part of that. They haven't been. Put those people back into 1939, Hitler's forces advancing across Europe, I think it would be a very different question. And, you know, from my personal point of view, yes, I would sign up if it was World War II level thing. Would I sign up to go and do some of the wars that we fought in the last 20 or 30 years? No, absolutely. I've campaigned and protested against them. So, and been proven right, I would argue, on all three. But, you know,
it might
so
not be a world war. I mean,
No.
what some of the military experts are saying is that Russia, that Putin could well invade another country on its
I think we have to put this in some perspective, though. Putin is a tyrant, is a dictator, is an awful human being who, you know, abuses human rights of the people in his own country as well, we shouldn't forget. But he's not kind of a superpower on the scale that Hitler had become by the late 1930s. You know, he's been bogged down in a war in Ukraine for 3 years. The idea he's going to come rampaging across Europe to the shores of England is quite fanciful, to be honest. And we shouldn't talk up the threat.
But what
nor
about
should
a
we
smaller
minimise
country, a country with less defence than us?
Less defence than Ukraine. I mean, that's possible, I suppose. But look, it would obviously be a multi-nation response, and the UK does have a sizable standing army, as do other countries like France, like Germany, like the United States, and probably the days of conscription probably have gone, by and large, and it's not quite clear who Russia's allies would be. I mean, we shouldn't forget, Germany had Italy and Japan and other major nations willing to put their necks on the line for them. That's not really true of Russia.
Yeah, and Andrew's absolutely right. Before we get to the stage of talking about conscription, as Annabelle said, we really have a huge problem in the British Armed Forces right now with recruitment and retention. There are currently more people leaving the armed forces than there are joining. And John Healey said that he wants to set out a plan to reverse that trend and to build up the size of our armed force in terms of the manpower capability. But they're not at that stage yet, and they know there's a lot of work to do. So why are people leaving? And once if we can address that question, then we can go on to answering how do we build up the size of the armed forces. But right now we need to stop people leaving the armed forces. And then we can get on to a wider description about how big it should be should the time come that we need to rapidly and swiftly increase the size of our defence capability.
OK, now MPs are back in Parliament today after the week Whitsun break. And one of the big things that everyone is already talking about is next week's spending review. And there's an awful lot of numbers involved in that. But luckily, the BBC's Ros Atkins has been looking into this for a Panorama programme. It's out tonight. It's called Is Britain Broke? And we can speak to him now, to Ros. Thanks very much for joining us. I suppose the question is, Ros, is Britain broke?
Hi, Vicky. Well, certainly the UK's public finances are under a lot of pressure. You've been talking about one of the reasons why, the increase in defence spending, and that's certainly an important factor, but it's not the whole story. And in this panorama, we've tried to explore some of the major pressures that are being exerted on the UK's public finances. Within the programme, we look at ageing population, for example. Back in 1948, in the decade when the modern welfare state was created, 11% of people in the country were 65 or over. It's almost double that now. And of course, there are many reasons to celebrate us all living longer, but there are costs there, in particular with relation to healthcare and social care. So that's one factor. Another is rising expectations, what we're looking for from the state. If you take areas such as healthcare, as new technology and new treatments become available, often our hope is that we can access them. And of course, that comes with costs too. Then we've also got the state of the UK economy. It's been on the receiving end of three major shocks in recent years: the 2008 global financial crisis, then the pandemic, then the war in Ukraine. And that's had a multitude of different impacts on the economy. One I'd highlight is that we've had to borrow a lot of money to get through those crises, and our annual debt repayments now are over £100 billion a year. Just to put that in context, that's roughly double the defence budget. And then finally, I'd talk about the change in the welfare state. What it used to do and what it's doing today is quite different, and that also comes with a cost. Just one example on that: health-related benefits have increased close to 50% in the 5 years that followed the start of the pandemic. And when we put all of those things together, the defence spending you've been discussing, with the ageing population, rising expectations, the state of the UK economy, and the changing nature of the welfare state, all of that is useful to factor in as we consider the politics and the promises that you're covering on the show.
And actually, Ros, what strikes me is that we quite often talk about £9 billion, the headroom that Rachel Reeves might or might not have, arguments over one spending commitment or another, which might be a couple of billion. The scale of this is enormous, isn't it? Do you think politicians are being honest about that and about the trade-offs that there are?
Well, the scale of the challenges facing our public finances are enormous, and certainly you can find people who think that politicians need to be more direct with us. One of those people is Paul Johnson, the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and I've been talking to him for Panorama.
One of my huge frustrations about last year's election campaign is that neither of the major parties were being honest about the trade-offs. They were claiming that they wouldn't have to have significant tax rises or spending cuts. We saw very quickly in the budget that that wasn't clear.
Now, the government would say it is focused on the challenges the UK is facing, that it inherited a black hole in public finances and that its emphasis is on growth. And let's be clear, if the economy were to grow at a faster rate than it currently is, that would be incredibly helpful to the UK's public finances. But in and amongst all of the political debate about what to do next, we can be certain on one thing, Vicky, and it's that the equation that underpins our public finances has significantly changed. And as we assess all of the options for how the government spends money and where it spends money, it is really helpful to keep that in mind.
Sounds like a great watch, Ros. Just remind people where they can see it.
You can see it right now on BBC iPlayer, and you can see it on BBC One at 8 p.m. tonight.
Great. Thank you so much for speaking to us. So we heard there from Paul Johnson saying that politicians just aren't being honest with the public about all of this.
Well, the point is, the reason why we've had a comprehensive funding review, and it's the first one for 17 years, is that we've gone through each budget line by line. It's like anybody managing a household, looking to see where savings can be made, what subscriptions can be cut, you know, how can we live within the finances that we've got. But what we are trying to do, or want to do, is reinvest in our economy. And we're actually increasing capital expenditure by 1.3% a year. That's £70 billion per year. So that means we can invest money in things like infrastructure, schools, hospitals, where we need to grow our economy. And what we need to do is use that money effectively to create new jobs, which is why I welcome the defence spending review, because that at the very minimum will create 30,000 jobs at the very start of it. So we need British jobs in order to reinvest into our economy so that we can grow it. So it works hand in hand so that we rebuild our economy, because we have to face it. We have inherited something that's been completely broken. Whilst we talk about that £22 billion black hole, that was there. We've had to fix that, and now we're working on fixing our economy and rebuilding our infrastructure.
And are they being honest? I mean, I don't just mean the Labour government, but all the governments we've had.
I think that politicians of all stripes are being dishonest about the financial predicament that we currently find ourselves in. The national debt is now absolutely enormous. We spent £20 billion in April over what was forecast borrowing. The deficit continues to tick up, and we're unwilling to make the ultimately difficult choices that have to be made to address that. We need to drastically reduce our welfare bill. The welfare state has expanded far beyond its original purpose of providing a safety net to the most vulnerable. Now, over half of people in Britain today are net recipients from the state. This is simply unsustainable. And as Ross says, we do have worsening demographics. Our worker to grey ratio is going down and down. There will be fewer people who are able to support the welfare state, who are able to support the NHS going forward. And Labour may say that they inherited a broken economy, and I do have some sympathy with that position, but they seem to be taking a sledgehammer to any of the functioning parts that were able to survive over the 14 years of Conservative governance.
Andrew, I saw you shaking your head at one point.
Yeah, look, I think there's a certain irreality going on across the political debate in this country. We broadly we shouldn't forget we are the 5th or 6th biggest economy in the world. This idea that we're broke and we haven't got any money, we've got huge pockets of wealth across the country as well. We are not a poor nation. We're not on our knees. What we don't have, unfortunately, is the same levels of tax in this country that they have in Scandinavia, in France, in Germany, in the fastest growing economy in Europe at the moment, Spain. We tax less, and yet we talk about this tax burden like it's some uniquely high thing in the UK, and actually all Western European nations are facing the same thing, which is an ageing population, as Ros said, which does put extra pressure on social care, on the NHS, and on the state pension. Now, we have a relatively ungenerous state pension in this country. It's far lower than in most other European countries. We have more people claiming it, which is why the welfare bill has gone up. We have more people working longer because we have a higher retirement age than many places in Europe as well, which means more people get to a certain point in their life and are off sick with disabilities and so on. And that's partly why that has gone up as well. There's also a mental health crisis. We see the waiting list for the NHS, both for physical health and mental health. And that has a knock-on effect on the welfare state. So if you invest in the NHS and get some of those waiting lists down, you will actually save on the benefits bill as well. But look, we have to be serious. Do we want to live in a world where we have record levels of children living in poverty, record numbers of families in temporary accommodation, or do we want to invest in those things, which creates jobs if you're building housing? Unfortunately, at the moment, we have a situation where our welfare state is propping up private landlords because we haven't built council housing.
So what's
for the
answer?
last 30 years.
What would you be in favour of?
I think one of the biggest things, well, there are a number of options for raising. I mean, wealth tax covers a range of things rather than just a sort of one-off, let's grab some money off the rich people. But, which I'm not necessarily against, but I think there are more effective ways to do it and get regular income. Just equalising capital gains tax with income tax. It's ridiculous that people who go out and work pay a higher rate of tax than people who speculate on the stock exchange or sell houses and so on.
Well, except for the fact that those people are speculating with income which has already been taxed at the higher rate.
Well, yeah, but we all, I go out and buy things in the shops and I pay VAT on that, and that's income that's already been taxed. We all pay tax. I pay my council tax, and that's already been taxed out of my income. So it's not the same. Everyone pays multiple taxes.
But it would also disincentivise people from investing in businesses.
But they're not investing in businesses. They're speculating a lot of the time.
In order to grow, in order to create wealth, in order to
Most
create
small
jobs.
businesses get their money from banks, not from random investors
And I'm
speculating
afraid the
on the
fact
stock
is
exchange.
that in the
So
October
it's not true.
budget, Rachel Reeves increased taxes by £40 billion, which was the largest single
And I
increase
disagree,
in
by the way,
fiscal
with where she
statement
put those taxes,
for
but
decades.
that's not the point.
And yet in April, as I said earlier, she was forced to borrow £20 billion.
Well,
If
yes,
the
of course,
government
because they've inherited a very
have
weak economy, but-
have the public finances in ruder health after a £40 billion tax increase, how can the solution possibly be to increase taxes any further?
As Ross said, we have had multiple shocks since the banking crisis in 2008. The idea that one budget in 2024, with the greatest of sympathy to Rachel Reeves, who I'm not always sympathetic about, that could have solved 14 or 15 years, in fact 17 years since the banking crash, of kind of underinvestment in public services, weak economy, low growth, years of low growth we've had in this country. It's just kind of fanciful. And we do need to put more money into the NHS. We have put more money into the NHS, but it will take time to see the results of that. It takes time to train personnel. It takes time to get the waiting list down.
Well,
Let's just bring in Andrew Bowie. Where's your party in all of this? A smaller state? Are you still in favour of a smaller state?
Absolutely. And we went into the last election with fully costed plans to reduce the size.
You didn't reduce the size of the state when you were in power.
Well, we saw an exponential growth in the size of the civil service as a direct result of the COVID pandemic, and we had plans to reduce the size of that state, something that has not happened under the Labour government. In fact, we've seen it continue to grow over the past year. The fact is, talk about low growth. Yes, absolutely. We have had low growth in this country for far too long. But when we left office, we did actually have the fastest growing economy in the G7, something that has...
What have you reduced? And Labour are now trying to means test the winter fuel allowance, for example, and you're against that.
Well, we're against taking the winter fuel allowance off of some of the most vulnerable pensioners in the country, it being the first announcement of this Labour government with no thought given as to how those vulnerable people would be protected and kept warm through the winter. So, I mean, yes, of course we're against that policy. What would you cut now if you were in power? Well, the fact is we're many years away from the next election. We're not going to set out our plans just now. But in the last election,
you can't say I want a smaller state and not say how.
I'll tell you what we wouldn't have done. We wouldn't introduce Labour's jobs tax, which is resulting in many people becoming unemployed and some companies having to shut their doors, which will obviously have a knock-on effect on the welfare state as more people go to seek unemployment allowance. We've seen growth halved as a direct result, the IMF said, as a direct result of some of the decisions taken in the budget by Rachel
So that's
Reeves.
a tax cut. That's not reducing the size of the state.
But we said we would reduce the size of the civil service if we were lucky
civil
enough
servants
to be
would...
Well, the civil service is now its largest number of people working within government, I think, ever.
And I think Labour does have plans to cut that.
They do, and we look forward to seeing those plans come to fruition, but there's no evidence that that is happening thus far. So look, we need to reduce the size of the state. We need to reduce the cost of government. We need to take drastic action to address the burgeoning welfare state crisis that we've got on our hands right now. Again, we had plans in our manifesto to do just that in a way that wasn't the back of a fag packet plans that unravelled within a week of the Labour Party producing them just before the recess just gone. So I do have concerns that the economy is being affected, yes, by international factors, Trump tariffs, crises overseas, but actually more as a direct result of some of the anti-business, anti-growth policies that are coming out of the Treasury right now. They're actually doing more harm than actually would have otherwise been the case.
Joe, on welfare, where do you stand on that? Do you think we should be reducing the welfare budget? That is forecast to rise an awful lot, isn't it?
I agree, we don't have a choice.
How do you do that? That's always the question, isn't it?
For me, it is about enabling people back into work. It's working with employers so that there can be adjustments in the workplace. So there's also changing the law so there's a right to try, so people can be eased into work. And we need to ensure that people are putting a wage on the table, because I think that actually lifts aspirations and raises opportunities and creates that change in communities where poverty is extremely low, far too low. And so for me, I think the government is taking the right step. Those people who are long-term ill or never work because of their disability have to be protected within that system, but the focus has to be on people committing and contributing to the economy.
But there's lots of your colleagues, particularly when it comes to child poverty, who think that a Labour government needs to be doing more. And of course, one of the things that they think that should be done is that you should scrap the 2 child benefit cap, where there is a restriction on families claiming welfare if they have more than 2 children. Andy Burnham last night, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, said that on BBC's Westminster Hour. What do you think?
My view is that I'm quite comfortable with the cap remaining. I feel that we need to support those children in poverty in many, many different ways. Lifting out of poverty is a phrase that we all use, but it's structural change that makes that difference. And it's enabling that they get access to good education, good healthcare, and that their families are assisted in working rather than being long-term.
So the way out of poverty is for those families to work. Yes. Andrew, where are you on that argument?
Well,
Andy Burnham saying one thing, Joe saying another.
It's simply not true to say the way out of poverty is to work, because 2/3 of children living in poverty in this country are in households where somebody works. So you have to tackle low pay, you have to tackle insecure work as well. Which I'm not saying Joe is opposed to either, by the way. You have to tackle things like 0 hours contracts, which, to be fair, Labour's Employment Rights Bill does, hopefully, when it's implemented. And, you have to boost wages. We have incredibly low levels of pay in this country and incredible proportions of people in low-paying sectors of the economy. And boosting that is through investment in various ways. You also have to boost the training budget, which of course was slashed over the last 15 years, because you can't create jobs if you haven't got the trained people to fill them, which is why we then have higher levels of migration. And again, there's a kind of unreality about the way politicians talk about migration. If we've got a larger, I think Annabelle referred to it as, the grey mass of, kind of people who are retired, then one way to rebalance that is to have higher levels of migration, people working in this country paying taxes in order to rebalance
we've
the
tried that
balance
already,
between workers
and it's ultimately a Ponzi scheme. The problem is that it hasn't worked. Immigrants themselves not only age and are therefore a drain on public services, just in the same way as people who were born in Britain would be, but they also very quickly adapt to the native birth rates. So it's not as though those coming from countries that might have a higher fertility rate than our own will come here and have lots of children who could be the taxpayers of the future.
So Nigel Farage,
proven not to work.
Reform UK say that they you can encourage people to have more children by reversing the 2 child benefit cap. Do you agree with that?
I'm highly sceptical. I think that the 2 child benefit cap should remain in place. One reason where I agree with Andrew is that it doesn't address the root causes of poverty, unemployment, low wages, family breakdown. Another is I don't really see why those families who've decided not to have more children because they can't afford to do so should, through their taxes, be forced to subsidise those who don't take the responsible decision to stop at having 2 children. And I'm just going to pick up on one point you made, Andrew, if I can.
That's not
on
a really
0
fair
hours
thing
contracts, the vast majority of people who are working in things like the gig economy favour flexibility over having the secure work that you talk about. Of course, there will be instances of unscrupulous employers who are exploiting workers, but the vast majority of those people are actually very happy with the work that they're doing, and that's what all of the surveys that I've seen said. And just to the wider discussion, you know, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing again and again, expecting different results. We have had a high tax, high spend economy, high spend economy for years now. We have been on an upward trajectory, such that taxes are to reach the highest level in 7 decades at the end of this decade. And we seem to believe that the solution is just to tax people more and to pour that money into the public sector. It simply isn't working. To the NHS, you know, real-term spending increased by 2% on average over the years that the Conservatives were in government, and the NHS has got 7 million people on the backlog. How can we possibly believe that the answer to this is just to tax people more in order to pour more into that money pit? In fact, what we need to do is have a very difficult discussion about how we might change the funding model of the NHS such that it can replicate.
We'll do that another day. We'll do that another day.
But in Europe,
to get back to
the
welfare budget, Joe, are you content that we're in a situation, it seems, where the Prime Minister seems to be reversing his thought on means testing the winter fuel allowance? So there will inevitably, if he does that, probably be pensioners who are pretty well off who will get that. And then at the same time, you have a 2-child benefit cap.
It's a dilemma, but the thing is about the winter fuel allowance, it became universal, apart from the people who were on the lowest levels of income. In my view, it should be raised, and I very much support his announcement week before last. We were elected on the promise that we'd look after pensioners, and sadly, in my view, it's a decision that came too far and too fast, and so I welcome the shift.
But there are some in your party who say that actually pensioners, because of the triple lock, where their income to a certain extent is protected, that they have had a protected income, whereas you have families with children who that hasn't been the case.
There's a contradiction, but my view is that we have to invest in services locally for much poorer families. And as I said, it's about having access to good jobs with the protections that this government has brought in for people who are low paid, and in order to ensure that those jobs are protected and that wages are good, and also access to good quality education and public services so that those families can thrive.
Okay,
the reason that we brought the triple lock in when we came into government in 2010, you know, we inherited a situation where we had some of the worst rates of pensioner poverty in Europe, and the triple lock was brought in to address that. What Labour announced in the summer, the single announcement that they made before we went on summer recess, the withdrawal of the winter fuel allowance, would have, and indeed, harmed some of the most vulnerable pensioners in society, because sadly we do still have
but they have kept the triple lock
in this country. Thankfully, they have kept the triple lock that we established. I think it's right that they're looking again at the winter fuel allowance withdrawal, but it's very unclear as to what is actually coming down the tracks regarding that. Is it means testing? Are they raising the threshold? Will it be a reversion to universal? Nobody really knows. We seem to be rushed out ahead of PMQs just before the
we will know
spring
before
recess.
The winter,
we will know before the
Keir
winter.
Starmer,
I'm sure that's a great comfort to many pensioners out there.
Let's look at another headline, this one from BBC News. More than 1,000 migrants arrived in the UK after crossing the English Channel on Saturday, the highest number recorded on a single day so far in 2025. And this was Keir Starmer's response, which he gave earlier today.
Nobody should be making that journey across the Channel, and it's our duty to make sure that we ensure that they don't. We are working very closely with our counterparts in France and elsewhere to take further action in northern France. And of course, we are giving enhanced powers to our own law enforcement through the Borders Bill, which is currently going through Parliament.
Joe, do you think that your constituents listening to that will think that Sir Keir Starmer's got the right answers?
They'll be frustrated. And what we need to do... So the Home Secretary went to France, was the first Home Secretary to go to France since we left the EU a couple of months ago, where she negotiated an agreement whereby the French police can actually go into the water to stop those boats leaving the French coast. At the moment, the regulations are going through the French system.
So it's not happening yet?
No, but there is a commitment that they will be able to stop those boats very, very shortly. We're creating a intelligence unit at Dunkirk that will actually be able to identify where the gangs are being organised and where they're coming from, and we're using that to feed into our
But that's about locating
process.
the gangs, isn't it? And,
Yes.
and we've heard Sir Keir Starmer a lot talk about smashing the gangs. But there will be lots of people, maybe some of your constituents, who will be saying, you've still got up to over 1,000 migrants coming on one day.
Yeah, and
that's not going to make any difference in the short term.
I agree, but the Borders Bill is currently making its way through Parliament, where we have set up creating a border command which have the intelligence and the skills and the finances to actually detect and smash those gangs from where they're coming from, which is in the Middle East.
And you think that will work? And what kind of timescale?
Well, as soon as we get the bill into legislation, then we have the powers to do that. So timescales are tight. This is one of our flagship pieces of legislation. So we're hoping to have it in the statute book by the end of this summer, and then we can actually start to take proper action.
I mean, your party knows how hard this is to deal with because you weren't able to do it either.
Well, we tried very hard to get our Rwanda policy through Parliament for months. In fact, it was stymied at every stage by the Labour Party, Labour and Liberal Democrat peers in the House of Lords, and we finally got it across the line within days of it coming into effect and that deterrent factor being established, which Rwanda would have been. Labour won the general election and then disestablished the policy, got rid of it, and so there was no deterrent. And we're now nearly a year on from that general election. We're seeing higher numbers than ever cross the English Channel because they see Britain as even more of a soft touch than it was before. It's absolutely absurd. They had a policy of smashing the gangs and stopping the boats. A year on, we're seeing higher numbers than ever coming into this country. It's not working.
I think we have to put this in a bit of perspective rather than this kind of Little Englander thing. We have a global migration crisis at the moment. There are 100 million people displaced from their countries. Europe takes a tiny proportion of that, and within Europe, Britain only takes 8% of the asylum seekers that reach Europe. We take fewer than Spain, than Germany, than France, than Italy. We are not this kind of magnet for the world's asylum seekers, and sometimes politicians talk as if we are, and we're not.
Well,
we are not a
both
soft
these politicians
touch.
do
It
think
is
that.
ridiculous to say that, and well, it's not borne out by the evidence, is it? Because they're not coming to the UK.
Well, they're actually coming in. Partly because we speak the English language, which is universal, but they're coming in because our economy allows people to work in the black economy. And so it's not just about asylum seekers.
That's true in Spain, in France, and Italy. They have black economies as well. In Germany, you know.
If you look at levels of
economy,
if you look at it's something that needs to be taken control of. But also, if you look at levels of inward migration, they're far too high. What we need to do is develop skills and opportunities. It's about having skills and opportunities for British people to take those jobs. At the moment,
agree, but that's a separate point. To be fair.
Sorry.
I'm sure she hasn't said anything wrong. That's definitely not the Prime Minister calling you.
But look, I do think we need to speak about this in a more human way. You know, these are human beings crossing our borders. You know, 178 people died in the Channel last year. I want to stop the boats because I don't want people drowning in the Channel. Absolutely. 12 of them were children as well. I mean, it's absolutely horrific that this is happening. And the reason why nobody and there are hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians living in this country, rightly, there was a cross-party consensus on that, and not a single Ukrainian has crossed the Channel in a small boat because there is a scheme for them safely to get to the UK. There are other places where people are fleeing war and persecution, and there are no such routes at all for them to get here safely. So they are forced into these routes. So we have to look at a system that pushes people into this way, and the last Conservative government was very good at closing down safe routes into the country, which is why we've seen this increase over the last, decade of people travelling to the UK in small boats.
We've got about a minute left, Joe. I just want to ask you about the Attorney General, Lord Hermer, who made comments comparing calls for the UK to depart from international law, the European Convention on Human Rights, with arguments made in 1930s Germany. He's since apologised, as we can see here. He says he regrets the clumsy reference to Nazi Germany. What do you make of his comments? I
accept his apology, but the dialogue and discussion on how we work within ECHR is absolutely critical, and I welcome that he's bringing that forward. Government have already said that we want to discuss that in Parliament, look at how particularly Article 8 is implemented. Other European countries are doing exactly the same, and I want us to work hand in hand with countries across Europe.
He said his words were clumsy. I mean, he's the Attorney General. Is he the right person to be in that role?
He is. I met him 2 weeks ago on the very issue of ECHR, and we're very much attuned, not particularly on the language he used, but the way forward is the way that, you know, both him and I agreed on.
Very, very briefly.
No, I don't think it's appropriate. And I don't understand why we believe it's always wrong to withdraw from international conventions. They all provide for states to depart. We need to be sure that we're putting our national interests first. And if that involves leaving the ECHR, something that this Labour government should be willing to do.
Thank you very much. That's all for today, but I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and iPlayer.